Feldwebel Ernst Weber picked up the submachine gun lying beside its dead British owner, examining it with something between contempt and curiosity. The weapon looked like it had been assembled in a plumbing workshop. A crude metal tube for a barrel, stamped sheet metal for the receiver, a skeletal wire stock that folded against the side, and a magazine protruding awkwardly from the left rather than underneath like a properly designed weapon. No wooden furniture, no finish beyond basic bluing, welds visible along the seams. It was the ugliest military weapon Weber had seen in 5 years of combat. "British craftsmanship is finished," he said to his corporal, holding up the gun for inspection. "Look at this trash. They're arming their soldiers with scrap metal welded together by amateurs." His corporal laughed, reaching for the weapon. "Let me see this masterpiece of British engineering." The laughter stopped when the British counterattack came 20 minutes later. The battle. Weber's squad was engaged in close-quarters combat through village streets, fighting house to house against British infantry who moved with practiced efficiency through rubble and ruins. The distinctive sound of 9mm submachine guns was constant, not the rapid, expensive chatter of German MP-40s, which his squad was rationing ammunition for, but the slightly slower, more deliberate fire of the crude British weapons that seemed to be everywhere. Weber fired his captured Sten gun almost accidentally when British soldiers burst into the building he was defending. The trigger was overly sensitive, the weapon firing before he had intended, but it worked. The magazine fed smoothly. The bolt cycled without jamming despite the dust and debris in the air. He fired through the entire 32-round magazine in controlled bursts, the weapon remaining stable and controllable despite its crude appearance. When the engagement ended and British forces had withdrawn, Weber examined the Sten again with a different perspective. It was still ugly. It still looked like something assembled from pipe fittings. But it had functioned flawlessly under combat conditions, and it was light enough to carry easily, while substantial enough to be an effective weapon. He'd seen German soldiers struggling with ammunition shortages, carefully conserving rounds for their precisely machined weapons. The British were apparently using weapons so cheap they could afford to issue them in enormous quantities, and ammunition generously. Maybe the British understand something about war that we don't. The crisis of Dunkirk. Britain's decision to develop the Sten gun emerged from a military catastrophe that threatened the nation's ability to continue fighting. The evacuation from Dunkirk in May-June 1940 saved approximately 338,000 British and Allied soldiers from destruction or capture, but abandoned nearly all of the British Expeditionary Force's heavy equipment in France. Approximately 7,000 tons of ammunition, 90,000 rifles, 2,000 artillery pieces, and hundreds of vehicles were left behind or destroyed. The British Army in June 1940 had sufficient small arms to equip perhaps 6 divisions, inadequate for defending Britain against invasion, much less for rebuilding expeditionary forces. The strategic situation was desperate. Germany controlled continental Europe from Norway to Spain. Invasion seemed imminent and likely. Britain needed to arm its forces rapidly while simultaneously preparing civilian home guard units that might resist German landings. Traditional armaments production couldn't meet these needs. British small arms industry was designed for peacetime production of quality weapons, requiring skilled labor and substantial time per unit. Expanding that production to meet wartime needs would require years that Britain didn't have. The submachine gun problem. The requirement for submachine guns was particularly acute. These weapons were essential for close-quarters combat, for urban fighting, for situations where rifle range wasn't necessary, but high volume of fire was critical. Britain's existing submachine gun inventory was minimal. The Thompson submachine gun, manufactured in America, was an excellent weapon, but expensive and complex to produce.
At roughly $200 per unit and requiring approximately 70 hours of skilled machining, Thompsons couldn't be obtained in the quantities Britain needed. The War Office specification for a new submachine gun reflected desperate circumstances. Weapon must be cheap to produce, simple enough for manufacture in non-specialized facilities, reliable under combat conditions, effective at close range. Cost and production speed were prioritized over refinement or appearance. The specification essentially asked designers to create a weapon that violated every principle of traditional gunsmithing in favor of brutal functionality that could be mass-produced by semi-skilled labor. The plumber's solution. Major Reginald Shepard and Harold Turpin approached submachine gun design from an engineering perspective that prioritized manufacturing efficiency over aesthetic appeal or traditional craftsmanship. Neither man was a traditional gunsmith. Shepard was an Army officer with an engineering background. Turpin was a designer at Royal Small Arms Factory Enfield, but his experience was in production methods rather than weapons design per se. Their lack of traditional gunsmithing background proved advantageous. They weren't constrained by conventions about how military weapons should look or be manufactured. They focused entirely on what the weapon needed to do and how it could be made most efficiently.
The revolutionary design. The design they developed was revolutionary in its simplicity. The barrel was a simple steel tube, rifled but otherwise unadorned. The receiver was stamped from sheet metal and welded together rather than being machined from solid stock. The bolt was a basic chunk of metal with firing pin and extractor. The magazine housing was welded to the receiver's side rather than underneath, simplifying manufacturing at the cost of aesthetic awkwardness. The stock was a skeletal wire frame that folded alongside the weapon, reducing bulk when not needed. The entire weapon contained only 47 parts, compared to over 100 for the Thompson or 70 for the German MP40. Fewer parts meant faster assembly, fewer points of potential failure, and simpler maintenance. The weapon could be manufactured using basic metalworking equipment available in any competent machine shop. Stamping and welding were faster and required less skilled labor than machining and fitting. The design assumed that workers would be semi-skilled at best, and that manufacturing would occur in facilities never intended for weapons production. The economics. The cost was extraordinary, approximately £2 per unit in 1941 prices, roughly 1/10 the cost of a Thompson. The manufacturing time was similarly remarkable, 5 man-hours per weapon compared to 70 for a Thompson. This meant that a single factory could produce Stens at a rate that would have required 10 factories producing Thompsons, and those Stens would cost a fraction of the Thompson's price. For a nation facing an existential crisis with limited resources, these advantages were decisive. The prototype testing. Testing in late 1940 revealed a weapon that was crude but functional. Drawbacks. Accuracy at range was mediocre. The short barrel and simple sights made precision shooting beyond 50 meters difficult. The trigger was notoriously sensitive, prone to accidental discharge if handled carelessly. The side-mounted magazine made the weapon awkward to handle and prone to catching on equipment. The weapon was loud, had substantial muzzle climb during automatic fire, and lacked any refinement that peacetime weapon designers would have included. But it worked. The weapon fired reliably using standard 9mm ammunition that Britain could manufacture or capture from German stocks. The open bolt operation was inherently reliable, with few parts to break or malfunction. The open bolt design prevented cook-offs, premature firing from overheated chambers that plagued closed-bolt weapons during sustained fire. Field stripping required no tools and could be accomplished in seconds. Soldiers could maintain the weapon with minimal training. Damaged weapons could be repaired by anyone with basic metalworking skills. The production scaling was remarkable. Initial production in 1941 reached approximately 100,000 units. By 1942, production exceeded 500,000 annually. Peak production in 1943 reached over 1 million units, with multiple variants being produced simultaneously for different users.
Total wartime production exceeded 4 million units, making the Sten one of the most produced submachine guns in history. This production was achieved while Britain was simultaneously producing rifles, machine guns, artillery, vehicles, aircraft, and countless other military items, a testament to the weapon's manufacturing efficiency. The cost savings were strategically significant. 4 million Stens at £2 each cost approximately £8 million total, less than Britain spent on many individual capital ships or aircraft development programs. For that modest investment, Britain armed its infantry with close-quarters weapons that provided a firepower advantage in urban and close-terrain fighting. The cost-benefit calculation was extraordinarily favorable, enabling a capability that would have been unaffordable using traditional weapons. The frontline reality. British soldiers' initial reaction to the Sten was largely negative, viewing the crude weapon as evidence of Britain's declining military standards and industrial desperation. Troops accustomed to Lee Enfield rifles, which were well-made and aesthetically pleasing despite their age, found the Sten's crude appearance disturbing. The weapon looked cheap because it was cheap. The stamped metal and visible welds suggested hasty manufacture by incompetent workers. The awkward magazine placement and skeletal stock seemed like design failures rather than deliberate choices. Soldiers nicknamed it stench gun, plumber's nightmare, and various other derogatory terms that reflected their low opinion of the weapon's appearance and perceived quality. But combat experience gradually changed these perceptions. In North Africa, where dust and sand disabled more refined weapons, the Sten's simple mechanism continued functioning. The open-bolt design and loose tolerances that seem like evidence of poor manufacturing actually provided reliability under adverse conditions. British troops fighting in the Tunisian hills at Italian mountains found that the Sten's light weight made it easier to carry during extended operations than the heavier Thompson, and its simpler mechanism required less maintenance under field conditions.
The weapon's effectiveness in close-quarters combat became apparent during urban fighting in Italy. Stens cleared buildings and bunkers efficiently, providing high volume of fire in situations where accuracy beyond point-blank range was irrelevant. The 9mm round was adequate for close combat while producing less recoil than larger calibers, making the weapon controllable during automatic fire. British infantry learned to employ Stens in situations where they provided an advantage while relying on rifles for engagements requiring accuracy or range. By 1944, experienced British infantry had largely accepted the Sten as a useful tool, despite its limitations. Officers who'd initially resisted carrying such a crude-looking weapon now appreciated its utility in close combat. NCOs, who'd complained about its lack of refinement, recognized its reliability under conditions that disabled more sophisticated weapons. The weapon remained ugly, and its handling characteristics remained problematic, but it was effective within its intended role, and that effectiveness mattered more than aesthetic concerns or minor safety issues. The German paradox. German forces' reaction to the Sten evolved from contempt to grudging appreciation to systematic adoption of captured weapons for their own use. Initial mockery. Initial encounters produced mockery. German troops who captured Stens or examined them on dead British soldiers viewed the crude construction as evidence of British industrial decline. Propaganda photographs showed German soldiers displaying captured Stens as examples of British desperation. Intelligence reports noted the weapon's crude manufacturing, but initially dismissed it as inferior to German weapons. Combat experience produced a different assessment. German soldiers who actually fired captured Stens discovered they worked reliably and were pleasant to shoot, despite their crude appearance. The 9mm ammunition was identical to what German MP40s used, making captured Stens immediately useful without requiring a separate ammunition supply. The weapon's simplicity made it easy to maintain with minimal tools. German troops began keeping captured Stens as supplementary weapons, particularly for situations where a disposable weapon was useful or where standard-issue weapons were unavailable.
By 1943, German forces were systematically using captured Stens, particularly on the Eastern Front, where equipment losses were high and resupply was irregular. Some German units preferred Stens to their own MP40s, finding the British weapon's reliability under adverse conditions superior to the more refined German design. This preference was particularly notable given German forces' general reluctance to use captured equipment due to ammunition supply complications and maintenance challenges. The fact that German soldiers chose to use Stens despite these disadvantages indicated genuine appreciation for the weapon's practical advantages. German assessment reports from 1944 acknowledged the Stens' effectiveness, while noting its manufacturing crudeness. Analysts recognized that Britain had achieved remarkable efficiency by prioritizing function over form, that the weapon's simple design provided reliability advantages that more refined weapons couldn't match. Some reports recommended adapting German submachine gun design to incorporate the Sten simplification principles, though such recommendations were never implemented due to Germany's declining industrial capacity. The ultimate German complement was copying the Sten design. The German Gerät Potsdam, developed late in the war, was essentially a crude copy of the Sten intended for Volkssturm and partisan units. The weapon was never produced in significant numbers due to Germany's collapse, but its development demonstrated that German ordnance experts recognized the Sten's design merits enough to copy them when facing similar requirements for cheap, simple weapons that could be mass-produced quickly. The Normandy Advantage. D-Day operations demonstrated the value of the Sten in exactly the kind of combat conditions it had been designed for: close-quarters urban fighting where volume of fire mattered more than precision or range. British paratroopers dropping into Normandy carried Stens as primary weapons, valuing their lightweight and compact size over rifles' longer range. Commandos storming beaches preferred Stens for clearing bunkers and fortified positions. Infantry advancing through bocage country found Stens ideal for hedge-to-hedge fighting, where engagement ranges were measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. The weapon's tactical advantages in close combat were exactly what Normandy's terrain and tactical situation demanded. The combination of British military Stens and resistance forces Stens created a situation where German occupation troops faced automatic weapons from both regular forces and irregular fighters. Resistance members rose up to support Allied landings, attacking German supply lines and communications using weapons that the British had been supplying for years. The coordination between regular forces and resistance, both armed with the same basic weapons, created a unified effort that complicated the German response to the invasion. German defenders found themselves facing enemies armed with weapons they had dismissed as crude trash. British infantry cleared Normandy villages systematically, using Stens to suppress defenders while advancing through ruins. Resistance fighters ambushed German reinforcements moving toward invasion beaches, employing Stens in hit-and-run attacks that delayed the German response. The ugly British submachine gun that German propaganda had mocked was proving devastatingly effective in conditions where its advantages outweighed its limitations. Post-battle assessment. Post-battle assessments by both sides acknowledged the Stens' effectiveness in Normandy fighting. British after-action reports praised the weapon's reliability and suitability for close combat. German analyses noted the effectiveness of British small-unit tactics that employed submachine guns aggressively. The weapon that neither side had considered particularly impressive in peacetime exercises had proven ideally suited for the brutal reality of urban and close-terrain combat. The resistance arsenal. The Stens' greatest strategic impact came through its distribution to resistance movements throughout occupied Europe, creating an armed force that tied down German troops and supported Allied operations. Britain's Special Operations Executive recognized that the Sten was the ideal weapon for resistance forces. Its simple design meant that resistance members with minimal training could operate and maintain it. Its cheap manufacturing cost meant Britain could afford to distribute weapons in massive quantities. Its reliability under poor maintenance conditions meant it would continue functioning despite irregular care by non-professional soldiers. Mass distribution. Beginning in 1942, Stens were airdropped to resistance groups throughout occupied Europe as standard armament for underground forces. The distribution scale was enormous. French resistance received over 100,000 Stens by D-Day. Polish Home Army received tens of thousands. Norwegian, Danish, Belgian, and Dutch resistance groups all received substantial quantities. Even partisan forces in Yugoslavia and Greece received Stens through British supply operations. The weapon became a symbol of British support for resistance movements and a practical tool that armed underground forces throughout occupied Europe. Tactical impact. For resistance fighters, the Sten provided a capability they desperately needed. Its automatic fire was valuable in ambush situations where volume of fire compensated for fighters' limited training. Its compact size made it concealable and easier to transport than rifles. Its 9mm ammunition could be captured from German forces or manufactured in clandestine workshops using available materials. Resistance forces learned to employ Stens effectively in hit-and-run attacks, assassinations, and sabotage operations that harassed German occupation forces. Strategic effect. The German response to widespread distribution of Stens among resistance forces was concern approaching alarm. Occupation troops faced enemies armed with modern automatic weapons, creating security situations that required substantial garrison forces. Every German soldier guarding railways or factories or communications infrastructure was a soldier not fighting on the Eastern Front or defending against Allied invasion. The strategic effect of arming resistance movements with cheap British submachine guns was forcing Germany to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops to occupation duty, troops that were desperately needed elsewhere. The final accounting. 4 million Stens produced between 1941 and 1945 represented an 8 million sterling investment that armed British and Allied forces throughout the war and resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. That investment purchased capability that Britain desperately needed at a moment when traditional approaches to military procurement couldn't provide adequate quantities. The Sten met these requirements. It worked. The human cost. The human cost of the Sten's shortcomings is unknowable. Some British soldiers died because they were armed with Stens instead of better weapons. Some were killed by accidental discharges from overly sensitive triggers. Some lost firefights because the Sten's limited range and accuracy made them ineffective in situations where better weapons might have prevailed. These costs were real but impossible to quantify precisely. The human benefit is equally unknowable but likely substantial. British soldiers who would have had no submachine guns without the Sten's cheap production had weapons that gave them tactical advantages in close combat. Resistance fighters who would have been unarmed without Britain's massive Sten distribution had weapons that enabled them to fight occupation forces. Battles that might have been lost without adequate close-quarters firepower were won because British forces had Stens in quantity. The strategic calculation favored the Sten despite its shortcomings. Britain needed a specific capability and needed it immediately, using limited resources. Traditional approaches to military procurement couldn't provide that capability adequately. The Sten could and did. The weapon was successful not because it was well designed in an abstract sense, but because it solved a specific problem under specific constraints. That pragmatic success, achieved through willingness to accept a crude solution when a crude solution was what resources and time frame permitted, was a lesson that extended beyond this particular weapon to broader principles about how industrial nations wage total war effectively. The Sten gun stands as testament to engineering pragmatism over aesthetic perfectionism, to strategic necessity over traditional craftsmanship, and to the reality that in total war, the weapon you can produce in quantity today is infinitely more valuable than the perfect weapon you cannot manufacture in time.